Chapter 5 Moral Action, Part 1. One of the questions raised in moral philosophy is this: what is the criterion for moral action? That is, with which criterion can we morally assess actions and consider some actions as moral and others as common? In other words, what is the difference between moral action and common action? There is no doubt that a set of actions we do, just as sitting before a table spread and eating, are common and no one calls them moral. In this case, no one says that we are performing a moral action. Other actions, however, are considered uncommon and moral. An example is self-sacrifice. That is, while a person himself needs something, he chooses to give it to another person who is also in need of it. In this case, it is said that he performs a moral action. Before mentioning the criterion for moral action, we have to conceptually explain these two terms. The difference between training, tarbiyah, and morality, akhlaq. Training, or tarbiyah, is different from morality, akhlaq. Although morality is also a sort of training, and it means the acquisition of a kind of disposition, state, and habit. What is the difference between tarbiyah and akhlaq? As stated before, training signifies nurturing and molding and nothing else. From the perspective of tarbiyah, or training, the method of the goal of tarbiyah does not matter. That is, any notion of sanctity is not embedded in the concept of tarbiyah such that we could say that tarbiyah means to train a person so that he acquires qualities which are beyond that of an animal. In fact, physical training is also tarbiyah, and this term is also applicable to animals. A dog can also be trained. Whether the dog is to be trained so as to behave well with its master and protect its master's cattle from wolves or to guard his house, it's tarbiyah after all. These legions, which were formed by most colonial countries and would act upon whatever they were ordered to do, were a product of training, or tarbiyah. In the concept of akhlaq, however, the notion of sanctity is embedded, and for this reason we do not apply it to animals. For example, when a horse is given training, it is not said that it is morally trained. Akhlaq is exclusive to human beings, and a sense of sanctity is embedded in its meaning. As such, if we want to discuss technically, we have to say that the field of akhlaq and the field of tarbiyah are not identical, but rather two distinct fields. It is called the field of tarbiyah when referring to mere training in whatever form. This is not consistent with our motive of knowing how and for what purpose a trainee is being trained. But ethics, or the field of akhlaq, is something discordant with our motive to say that akhlaq is akhlaq after all, no matter how we deal with it. This is not so. A notion of sanctity is embedded in the concept of akhlaq, and thus we have to know the basis or criterion for sanctity. As such, we say that moral action is the opposite of natural action. Of course, the point must be clarified that what we say the opposite of natural action can be interpreted in two ways. One is for us to say that moral action means action that is against nature, and that we call every action that is against the dictate of nature a moral action. The other way is for us to say that moral action means unnatural action. It is evident that this does not mean the criterion, or that the criterion for moral action is that it is against nature, and we call moral action whatever action that is against nature. A person who mortifies his body inflicts suffering on himself and behaves against his nature. But we do not say that since he does something against his nature, his action is moral. This cannot be the measure, and no one says so either. What we call the opposite of natural action does not refer to something being against nature. Instead, it refers to unnatural actions. That is, actions which are inconsistent with natural actions dictated by human nature. Man performs them according to his natural constitution. Every action which is done by a person according to his natural constitution is a natural action, and a moral action is not the same as an unnatural action. Views regarding the criterion for moral action. Number 1. Love of others. Now, what is the criterion for moral action? Some have said that the basis and criterion for moral action is that it must be based upon love of others and not love of oneself. This is because one cannot do a voluntary action like talking and walking without any motivation. But there is a time when the motive of a person in doing an action is to preserve his interest or to parry a threat, and we call it moral action because every living creature, as dictated by his primordial nature, is instinctively in pursuit of preserving its interests and parrying the threats against itself. But as soon as the action of man is outside the realm of self-centeredness, ego, and individualism, and is oriented towards the love of others, preservation of others' interests, and parrying threats against them, then it becomes a moral action. So according to this view, every action which is within the realm of self-centeredness is not a moral action, and every action which is within the realm of love of others is called moral action. This is not a complete statement because it is possible that the same love of others is instinctive or natural in some cases and is dictated by nature, and this cannot be labeled moral. An example of it is the love of a mother, whether human or animal, toward her child. As dictated by instinct, every animal loves its child. Can we call this instinctive love of mothers towards their respective children a moral action? Is this a moral action or a natural action? As a matter of instinct, mother loves her child to the utmost, and according to this natural love to her child, she protects its interest and will even sacrifice herself for it. That is, she would take little and give more to it. As such, motherly love is not exclusive to human beings, as it is also present in animals. Self-sacrifice. Perhaps we may express this view in this way. Self-sacrifice is the criterion for moral action, but we have to know on what motive self-sacrifice is done. Sometimes a person performs self-sacrifice and gives preference to others over himself on account of love of fame and reputation, nationalism and tribalism, or other factors. It happens many times that due to certain nationalistic and other feelings, self-centeredness or desire for historical legacy, individuals therefore sacrifice themselves. Moreover, these people are great egoists. Thus, mere self-sacrifice cannot be the criterion for an action to be called moral, because self-sacrifice can also be compatible with selfishness. Again, this first description we have made, that every action whose motive is love of others and not self-centeredness is a moral action, is more accurate, but as we have said, it is not sufficient enough. Number 2, the intrinsic goodness and badness of actions. Our predecessors said that moral actions are those actions that have intrinsic goodness, and on the contrary, immoral actions are those actions that have intrinsic badness. And they believed that the human intellect can perceive the intrinsic goodness of moral actions as well as the intrinsic badness of immoral actions. For example, they said that the intellect of everyone knows that truthfulness is intrinsically good, inherently honorable, and innately elegant, while lying is intrinsically bad. They were of the opinion that what governs a person may possibly be the animalistic power, such as the carnal desires, or the intellect. Carnal desires are what govern lascivious or gluttonous people. Some people are governed by anger, imagination, or satanic and mischievous acts. The intellect, however, governs others. Our predecessors believed that the intellect can perceive the intrinsic goodness or badness of things, saying that moral action is that which is done at the dictate of reason, and moral people are they who are governed by their intellects, and not by their carnal desires, anger, or imagination. In fact, they act as subordinate to the intellect in the sense that they receive orders from it. Their desires operate according to the intellect's assessment and reckoning. If the intellect says that this desire should be expressed here, then it should be expressed, and if not, then it should not be expressed. They argued that so long as what governs a person's being is the power of anger, ghadab, passion, shahwa, or imagination, wahima, his action is immoral, and in their words, animalistic. They were not using the term moral and natural, but instead they used human and animalistic. Of course, this contention is something that cannot be proved completely, although Socratic ethics is based upon it, especially the issue of intrinsic goodness or badness of actions, which philosophers do not give much credence to. At any rate, this is another view that the criterion for moral action is its being rational. That is, it must stem from the intellect and not from the power of anger, passion, or imagination. Number 3. Inspiration of the conscience. Another view is associated with Kant. He believes that moral action is that which is absolute. That is, a person does it not because of any motive, but rather for the sake of the action itself, and in line with discharging a duty he believes in that emanates from his conscience. The conscience of a person imposes a set of duties to him, and every action he performs is not for a certain purpose or goal, but in order to perform a certain duty. This is moral action. The status of a man here is exactly like that of a person in relation to another person. He is always ready to do whatever duty is assigned to him. He does not mind what orders this may be. He performs it whatever it may be. According to Kant, every action which emanates from the conscience is a moral action, and every action in which another thing interferes by delimiting its condition, scope, and characteristic can no longer be called a moral action. This is also another hypothesis. Number 4. Acquired love of others. Another view, which is close to the first, maintains that the criterion for moral action is love of others, provided that this love is an acquired one and not a natural one. Thus, we have two types of love of others. Number 1 is a natural one, like motherly love and prejudice in favor of one's tribe or family, and the second one is acquired love of others. That is, one does not have such a feeling as dictated by nature, but it is acquired or learned. If a person becomes a philanthropist as a mother loves her child, this state is acquired and becomes his second nature. This is yet another view. Number 5. The pleasure of God. There is another view in this regard, and that is, we have to basically trace morality to religious morality and say that all of the above are philosophical and theoretical. That is, those who expressed the above views wanted to set the criterion of morality minus religious faith. Moral action is action whose motive and objective is the pleasure of God. Of course, in this school of thought, the question of the self is also negated. That is, the objective cannot be the preservation of one's interest or parrying any harm against oneself. The ultimate aim is not even the protection of others' interests, but rather the attainment of God's pleasure. Protection of others' interest is also done with the expectation of winning the pleasure of God. In Surah Insan, that is, chapter 76, verse 9, it states, saying, "We feed you only for the sake of Allah. We do not want any reward from you, nor any thanks." It can be said that in all these views, there is no common point, and that is, morality is after all outside the domain of individual self. It means that action which aims at protecting one's interest or keeping harm away from oneself is definitely not moral. There is a discussion regarding actions which, in spite of being done to advance others' interests, are still not called moral. An examination of Kant's view. Now, let us discuss Kant's view briefly. As mentioned earlier, he was of the opinion that moral action is that which is free or immune from any condition, limitation, or motive, and it is not done because of any motive but the performance of a duty, and one does it as an obligation. But a question is posed, and that is it basically possible for a person to do something without having any purpose for himself? Some say that such a thing is impossible. It is impossible for a person to do something without getting anything in return. It is impossible at all for one to go to a certain destination or direction where his perfection, though relative, is not present. Even the person who acts contrary to his perfection acquires the perfection of one of his faculties through that act, and we call it contrary to perfection because it is contrary to his perfection from one perspective. Otherwise, it is impossible for a person to go somewhere where he does not acquire any kind of perfection. So, The contention that moral action is that action in which the doer has no motive for himself, and he gets no benefit in doing so, is not correct. The reply must be given that there is sophistry involved here, and we must get rid of it. There is a time when we say that the purpose of a man in every action is a benefit that he gets from it. It means a benefit which is intended for himself. If we say so, the reply can be given that it is not so. It is possible for a person to do something without getting any benefit himself, but it is beneficial to another person as well. It is possible to give the reply that when I do something, it's either that I enjoy doing so or I don't. Or by not doing so, either I'm annoyed or not. If I do not enjoy doing so, and I am not annoyed if I do not do it, then it is impossible for me to pursue it. When Imam Ali, peace be with him, was doing something with utmost sincerity for the benefit of others, was he also enjoying the work in the depth of his heart, or not? If he was not enjoying doing it, and not annoyed by not doing so, then it would have been impossible for him to do so. The sophistry is exactly the same here. Pleasure and suffering are not limited to benefiting or avoiding harm. Man is a creature who also takes pleasure in doing something for the benefit of fellow humans. He can also reach the station where he is more pleased about doing something for the sake of others than doing something for the sake of his own self, and or in protecting others' harm than in protecting himself from the same harm. So we have to distinguish the two. Most materialists assert that whatever man does is for his own interest. This is not so. He may reach a point when he does something for the sake of others. But if you say that man takes pleasure in whatever he does, we say that it is correct. But for him to take pleasure is not limited to gaining benefit for himself. It is the very perfection of man to be glad and take pleasure in doing something for the benefit of others. In saying that the action of man must be unconditional so as to be moral, if what Kant means by being unconditional is not to gain benefit for oneself, then it can be accepted. However, if he means not to give benefit to others as well, that is, it must not be conditioned by giving benefit to others, and one must do his duty without gaining pleasure from it, then such a thing is impossible. So, this is actually an explanation of the view which holds that the criterion for morality is giving benefit to others, and a refutation of it is that for such a thing is impossible. This is also an elucidation of the view which maintains that the action of man can be absolute. We argue that in a sense it can be absolute and it cannot be absolute in another sense. It can be so in the sense that it is free from the limit of self-interest, and it cannot be so in the sense that it is free from the limit of doing something for the sake of others and not taking pleasure from doing so. It is here that we can also discern the question of human conscience and know its meaning. Some believe that man has an intrinsic moral conscience, while others do not believe that, saying that man has been created to advance his own interest. Moral conscience, as conceived by Kant, is not correct, but if it is in the sense mentioned above, then it is not impossible. Its best proof is the appearance of moral actions in the sense of advancing others' interests, while the doer takes pleasure in doing so and also has a sense of fulfillment. End of chapter 5.